Pravit Moy Druzy. Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gertis. I'm a professor who tries to help you have some context about what's going on in the war in Ukraine. Okay, before we begin, one caveat. The video sometimes gets a little choppy. The audio is perfect all the way through. I apologize in advance. Here we go. So, some time ago, I've done, actually 3 times now, and about to be a fourth because I'm going to do another one on Scott Ritter tomorrow. More comprehensive, answering very specific questions that he raises because people are saying, well, that's just your propaganda as opposed to his propaganda. No, I'm trying to get to truth. So, um, as I've done these, people kept raising the name Richard Medhurst and said, you got to do one of these reaction videos on Richard Medhurst. Well, who's Richard Medhurst? Okay, so he calls himself an independent journalist. Richard Thomas Medhurst was born in Damascus, Syria in 1992. That puts him at 30. His parents served in various United Nations peacekeeping and observer missions. His mother's Syrian, his father's British. His parents' professional mobility means that he's lived in Syria, Pakistan, Switzerland, Austria. He was educated at various international schools. He speaks 4 languages. He's an independent journalist. Now, what is an independent journalist? It means you're not a journalist. You're a freelancer. So anybody can be an independent journalist. There's a difference between doing that, and by the way, I'm not opposed to this. I want everybody to be able to have a voice. I think something like YouTube is great, but there's a difference between an independent journalist who understands what the parameters are of how you have to source things and how you have to deal with facts, as opposed to someone like, well, anyone who can walk in off the street, put up a YouTube channel or a blog and say whatever they want. I want him to be able to say whatever he wants, but I also, that doesn't, at the same time, that doesn't mean that your facts are actually facts, or your views. Independent journalists tend to blur the lines between commentary and hard news facts, and this is where I think we find Richard Medhurst. Okay, so you find him in RT, and that's the first thing that you want to understand about him. The U.S. will bring, and his big topic is Assange, but he goes beyond that, and he's all in for everything beyond Russia as well. Okay, that makes sense. He is part Syrian. The U.S. will break its assurances on Assange. They'll say to Richard Medhurst, you just look him up on RT, and you'll find plenty of articles by Medhurst on YouTube. So now he has this video, ridiculous BBC biased reporting of the Kremlin drone attack. Okay, so he's going to make the case that the BBC is biased. I'm going to make the case that Richard Medhurst is biased, and you can determine who's right, me or him. Okay, so here's the video, and I'll pause periodically and talk about certain things.
We don't attack Putin or Moscow. We fight on our territory. We're defending our villages and cities.
Let me show you the BBC coverage of this incident, because it's so abysmal. You know, I really suffer for you guys. I gotta dig and look at and listen to all this mainstream media crap.
Okay, so that's the first assumption, is that the mainstream media is crap. Now, I kind of understand that. As a conservative, I find the mainstream media does have a narrative. I talked about that and the difference between facts versus narratives, right? There's a difference between what the facts are and what the narrative might be, and that's a fair point, and I think I get that. But I'm not sure that the alternatives that you would go to are going to be that much better for the most part. So you have to go to these alternative sources very judiciously, otherwise you wind up swallowing the Russian state media line, as far as Ukraine goes, hook, line, and sinker. So be careful.
Oh man, but let's have an interesting case study, okay? Let's take a look.
We're going to start in Russia because just in the last hour or so, we've seen the first pictures of President Vladimir Putin making a TV appearance. This is the first time we've seen him since that alleged attempt on his life. Let's take a look at these pictures. I should point out these are released by the Kremlin. This is a fairly routine-looking meeting there with his economic development minister. The message pretty obvious there, I'm sure, business as usual. Now, just to remind you, Russia claims that Ukraine was targeting President Putin in a drone attack on the Kremlin on Wednesday. We can take a look at the pictures of that alleged attack. The allegation to
Hold on, man. What do you mean alleged attack? There was an attack. There were drones sent at the Kremlin. Who do you think lives in the Kremlin? Mickey Mouse? Boris Johnson?
Okay, so I get where he's coming from, but it's not like the White House where Biden actually lives there. It's different. And Putin, while he has an apartment there, it happened at night. He doesn't stay in the apartment, generally speaking. And as far as attack goes, that's an open question. And we've tried to figure out what this is. Was it Ukraine? A number of leading potential possibilities here. Was it Ukraine? Was it a false flag attack by the Russians? Was it partisans on the ground? And if it was partisans on the ground, was it Ukrainian partisans? Was it Russian partisans? Was it even the FSB? We just don't know what it was here. But he's making an assumption that it had to obviously be Ukraine, and it does make sense. Ukraine's at war with them. But it doesn't make sense because getting that drone all the way into the Kremlin, which is ringed by air defense, and like something just doesn't seem right. But okay, I get where he's coming from, but there's a bigger picture than what he's allowing.
Who do you think they were targeting? Who do you think they were targeting? I mean, this is abysmal. This is so crap. Listen, man, you can say that, you know, what the Russians are accusing the Americans, Ukrainians of is wrong, and there's no evidence for it. But you don't have to go this far and start saying the alleged attack. No, there was an attack. It's not.
So it's not necessarily so that it was an attack as much as a statement. But I understand what he's saying. And if it was an attack, an assassination attempt, as Russia was saying, it was the worst assassination attempt ever because that thing looked like it had, you know, my kids' fireworks from the 4th of July or something on it. I mean, it was not that big of an explosion. So it's an open question about whether it was actually an attack, and if so, who did it come from? And that's the open question.
An alleged attack. There was an attack. There was a drone attack, and also they're kind of saying like, wait, keep in mind these, you know, this video here was released by the Russians, which is, you know, which happens often in this business. Yeah, every government releases videos. What?
Yeah, but the difference is that Russian state media tends to lie a lot. Vranyo, or however you pronounce that. I mean, they will put out false information very regularly. You can see that when you read Western media, free media accounts where journalists are able to go where they want to go, and then you see what the Russians say about something, and it's like, are we talking about the same incident or what?
What is so special about that? Anyway, you really have to look at how disgusting and biased this coverage is. This is not objective. It's really bad.
Okay, so when you want to talk about what is disgusting and biased, I think when you're saying something's disgusting and biased that's actually not, that's where you're not objective. So what I would like you to do is go identifying legitimate sources of information. And this talks about how to look at it. Now, here's the ISW's statement on methodology of what they do to ensure that they're doing the right thing. You can also watch facts versus narrative. The reason that I'm asking you to do that is because sometimes the facts are right, but the narrative is shifted because they choose different facts, and you have to be careful with that. And it's true, you do have to be careful with that. But BBC's coverage is actually pretty good, and he's just not giving it credence because it doesn't fit his narrative.
On the Kremlin on Wednesday, we can take a look at these pictures of that alleged attack. The allegation too that this was following the orders.
Like, look at that explosion. That explosion, if it blew up the dome, that would be an attack, right? There's a big difference between that, what you saw there, this little firework looking thing, and so we just don't know. Now, I've given some time to think about this. My first inclination was not that it was Ukraine, but that it was either partisans or false flag. And I'm not sure if it was false flag. Putin didn't really get the mileage out of it that I would have expected him to get out of it in the May 9th parade speech. So which leads me to have a feeling more toward partisans doing it on the ground, someone close by that was just again. But I don't know if that's what exactly that was, and that's just me with a hunch. I'm telling you that is not a fact. That is my inclination, but I don't know, and I'm telling you I don't know, and that's really where you can find some safety when somebody's willing to say that kind of thing. Okay, let's keep going.
United States about Ukraine and the US have denied any involvement whatsoever.
Yeah, of course they're going to deny involvement. But just let's think about this for a second. Just logically, who has the motive to attack the Russians, or every motive and reason to attack the Russians, right? Who has the means to attack the Russians? So who possesses these kinds of drones, and who is within range to launch these drones on the Kremlin?
And so those are actually really good questions. Who has the motive? Well, the Ukrainians want to do something. The Americans certainly don't want to do that because they don't want to kick off potentially World War III. NATO is probably out because they're with the Americans as far as that goes. The Ukrainians have the motive, but they don't necessarily have the means to get through air defense from around ringing Moscow. So that seems to indicate that it would be something more local that would be able to do it. But that's as much as I can piece together. And again, I don't have all the facts. So I'm just speculating as well.
You don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out where these rockets are coming from, man.
Actually, you do need to have more information than either he or I have to figure out where these rockets are coming from. And he doesn't necessarily have the life experience, and I'm sure he's going to, if he sees this, be upset. He does have 164,000 subscribers, so he's doing well for himself as far as putting out his views. But the way that he's piecing together his facts are just not mature. And I don't mean that in a slighting or mean way. I'm just saying he needs to think through this at deeper and deeper levels. Okay, let's keep going.
Launched a series of air raids on Kyiv overnight in apparent retaliation. But authorities say all the strikes were intercepted by air defences. And you can see these air defences actually working here in these pictures. Strikes also reported Zaporizhia.
Did you notice that? You really have to pay attention to how they kind of condition you and brainwash you and slip this into your brain. So in this case, they were saying that, well, the Russians attacked Ukraine with the planes, but every attack was intercepted. Look at the video. You can see the Ukrainian defenses working here to intercept the Russian weapons. So
it's not because of the video, it's because the video is there, but you also have reports from the Ukrainian government talking about how we hit X number of missiles, they shot so many, we knocked down X number of them, and on that particular day, the Ukrainian government did claim to have intercepted each of them. So that's what's going on there. It's not just taking their word for it or something because of the video.
And they're quoting who? The Ukrainian government.
That's correct.
So when it comes to the Ukrainian government, they state it as fact. What Ukraine says is a fact. What the Russians say is alleged.
And that is true. And there's a reason for that, because when the Ukrainian government speaks about these kinds of incidents and independent journalists are able to verify it, what they find is that it generally lines up. In fact, I can find very few incidents where it doesn't. The only thing that I question is the number killed, but I'm not on the ground, so I don't know the number killed, the official Ukrainian government count. I lean on the Americans count just because I figure it's a more conservative count, and so let me use that as my number. The Russians, on the other hand, tend to lie. I said this before, but they tend to lie, and they tend to do it a lot. Just go back to Bucha and look at the accounts of what happened in Bucha. Independent journalists on the ground from multiple countries seeing for themselves with their own eyes the atrocities that the Russians have done in Bucha, and then you see Russian RT, TASS, all those Pravda reporting and saying it's all made up, it's fake, it's actors, it's that. I mean, they tend to lie. So I would tend to take Ukraine's with a 1 grain of salt, right? I don't know it all, but I think they're generally telling the truth. And I take a pillar of salt when I'm looking at anything from RT, TASS, Pravda, that kind of thing. Okay.
It's a possible thing. It's not confirmed. I mean, this is not objective coverage. This is not. Actually,
it is objective coverage when you triangulate with objective journalist outlets, and you try to get a sense of who's saying what, and then you see the various pictures that way. Again, you have media outlets have certain journalistic integrity standards, and they try to stand by them. And you discount people. You could discount me if you wanted to, because I'm not that, although I'm trying to explain how that works. But you certainly should discount this guy, because he doesn't quite understand how this works. Now, he's biased, so am I. We're oppositely biased about this position. Okay, and I'll tell you that I'm biased. I'm all in for Ukraine. I'm an American conservative who is supporting Ukraine, and I'm supporting them because I see them as the victim, where I see Russia truly as the aggressor. And you can go back and say, well, yes, but Ukraine started it. Let's go back to 2014, and let's go back to what? No. Let's go back all the way down to the Budapest Memorandum, and let's go back to the starting point there, which Putin said that he wasn't going to honor, and he made good on not honoring that in 2014. And so I'm biased, but I also am trying to rely heavily on the facts. And Medhurst has either an alternative set of facts, or he's not really worried about that.
Biased coverage is very biased in favor of Ukraine. And the fact that people think the BBC is not state media, that it, even though it's funded by the British taxpayer, but they say, oh, well, it has an independent editorial board. I really don't care. The coverage is biased. It's in line with what the government wants. There was a scandal recently. The BBC chief had to resign just last week because it turned out that he had been giving money to Boris Johnson, and then Number 10 recommended him for the job to take. It's so corrupt. It's
okay, so I'm not going to talk about scandals, because scandals happen everywhere, and that's an unfortunate and stupid thing for them to be doing. But I will talk about the bias. Here's BBC News from All Sides Media. It is in the center. It leans slightly to the left. I wish it leaned a little bit more to the right, because that's my proclivity, but it's still in the center. Here it is in from another view of it, and the media bias charts. If you look at it, there are some straight shooters out there, or mostly straight shooters, like the BBC, like Reuters. Reuters tries to do a really good straight down the middle job without editorializing. The Wall Street Journal, with its hard news, not its opinion page, but its hard news, straight down the middle, same kind of thing. And I think we need to understand and recognize that, otherwise we get a false view of what's going on. It's not just the government's view, it's trying to report the facts.
Corrupt and biased.
And Odessa too. Well, our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, has been monitoring the Russian response to all this.
Well, the Kremlin continues to claim that this was a Ukrainian drone attack, but today it went one step further and suggested that America was actually behind the explosions over the Kremlin.
And they did. I read RT, and the the Russians were blaming both NATO and the United States for this drone attack, which would lead to a nuclear speculation, which this is the thing that the West desperately wants to avoid, which is absolutely absurd and silly. But when the Russians will blame the United States without evidence for that, that shows you that their state media that's doing that is not legit, or not valid, or biased.
Without providing any evidence, really, to back.
Fair enough. He's right. The Russians haven't provided any evidence. I've literally seen absolutely nothing that confirms this. So it is true that we, for the moment, are speculating it's the Ukrainians and Americans, because logically, who has, as I said, who has the motive and who has the means to attack the Russians? It's the Ukrainians and Americans.
Well, it's not the Americans, because the Americans don't want World War III. The Ukrainians have the motive. I'm not sure that they have the means to get 300 miles or kilometers or whatever from the border from Ukraine all the way to Moscow. That's a long haul to not be detected, and I can't see how the Ukrainians have the ability to do that. They could have special forces on the ground. That is true. There could be partisans doing it. It could have been a false flag. We just don't know at this point. And admitting that you don't know, there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually healthy.
But the thing is here that They don't employ any critical thinking. It's like they phrase things.
Wow, that just hurt my head for him to say, with everything that they said before, that they don't employ any critical thinking. Now look behind this guy. He's got a YouTube play button because he has over 100,000 subscribers, and he's saying this. It's really painful for me to watch.
Things in a way that makes you think that, well, of course this is ludicrous. Oh, who would attack the Russians? The Russians attack themselves. Well, yeah, what a shitty false flag. You're telling me that's a false.
But it could be. Now look at what happened in the Chechen War. And if you don't believe me, look up 1999 apartment buildings in Chechen to start off the Second Chechen War. It was a false flag operation, it looks like, and the Russians did it. And what you've done in the past is generally a good indicator of what you will do in the future.
False flag, and I'm supposed to believe it? Come on, man. And one thing I would say here.
Now, if there's bias, I think Medhurst isn't recognizing his own bias here. Come on, man, it's not. This couldn't possibly be. I get you. You're half Syrian. You don't like the British. You don't like the Americans. You like the Russians, and so you have this worldview through which you see things. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. You need to start to line up facts in a more profound way, in a more systematic way than what you're doing.
Is that the Ukrainians have been given billions in weapons. What do you think they're doing with those weapons? We've seen Nord Stream being targeted. We've seen Moskva. We've seen all of the Crimea Bridge. Symbols of Russian power or symbols of Russian influence being targeted specifically. Russian infrastructure being specifically targeted to send a message.
Okay, and that's fair. It's sending a message, and Nord Stream isn't the same as the Moskva. One was an attack on a ship, and the other, we don't actually know exactly what happened yet. And to say that we know what happened is a little bit foolish, because we really don't know, at least at this point, what has happened.
To manifest and to show force. Why is this any different? I mean, I would say it's different because it's more dangerous.
It's because we don't know. That's why it's different. We just don't have the facts yet. And to assume that you have the facts is a bit on the arrogant side, and we don't want to do that.
Why it's different. If you want nuclear missiles and a nuclear holocaust and for all of us to die.
So I've read enough RT and other Russian media to know that the only side that's raising the nuclear specter is the Russian side, and anybody repeating the Russian side is raising the nuclear, because this is how Putin is, and he's done this very well. He's deterred the West by raising the specter of nuclear war.
Yeah. In a nuclear winter, then yes, it's absolutely different, and keep on.
That up. So President Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, he told journalists this. He said that decisions about such actions, such terrorist attacks, he said, are made not in Kiev but in Washington. And he maintained that it was America that chose the targets for Ukraine. Time for some
Peskov lies so much, I don't know that he can even tell the difference between truth and lies at this point. Like, he just, I can show you dozens of examples of Peskov lying.
Context. The Kremlin likes to blame America for the war in Ukraine. Russia often accuses the West of waging war against Russia on the territory of Ukraine.
Dude, the West has given Ukraine, what is it, $100 billion now? I really can't keep track. I think that the secret number is probably higher. How is that not waging war against Russia?
Okay, so let me give you an example. So you live in an apartment complex, you're on the 6th floor, and somewhere down below you hear some rumbling. You look at the window and you hear a guy yelling, "Help!" because he's outnumbered by a couple of thugs that are about to beat him. So you can see that they have weapons he doesn't, and you look around your apartment and you grab a baseball bat and you toss it out the window. Now he has something, and you're looking for other things. You throw a knife down to him. You look around and you find something else to throw down to him. You're arming him. You're not actually at war with these guys, but you're arming him so that he has the ability to defend himself against the aggression. That's essentially the best analogy that defines what is going on in this war in Ukraine.
From the Ukrainian side, whether Ukraine is right to fight the Russians, it doesn't make a difference. he says time for context, and then he leaves out that Ukraine has $80 billion worth of weapons from the West. What the
This is basically part of the parallel reality created by Moscow about what is happening there. But it's important to keep in mind that in reality, in February 2022, it was President Putin who ordered the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, in a statement, Russia's foreign ministry claimed that the sabotage activities of the Ukrainian armed forces were gaining unprecedented momentum, and it added that Russia reserves the right to take retaliatory measures.
Christ, man, if you want to start talking about dates, somebody else could make the argument that, this goes back to 2014. So
what did I just say earlier? He's going to go back to 2014. Oh, when the U.S. overthrew, the U.S. didn't overthrow the regime. It was a peaceful, mostly, protest until the Ukrainian government, under the president that was cozy with Russia, cracked down too hard on his people, and then the people rose up against him. That was not a U.S. instigated coup d'etat, which is what you'll read if you read RT.
Why are you starting on February 24th of 2022? We can go back to 2014. Why not? There was stuff.
Yeah, let's go back to the Budapest Memorandum. Why not?
Happening back then, right? There was a coup in Ukraine.
See,
you forgot to mention that, right? And just look at what he says now.
And that he takes the language coup as an article of faith tells you the bias that's there.
Back to the studio.
Well, thanks to Steve for that update there from Moscow. We're going to look at
from Moscow. So the BBC's so Mr. Rosenberg, who's the BBC's Russia editor, is based in Moscow. He is in the Russian capital, which was just attacked by drones, and he is able to report freely, to speak as he wishes about the Russian government. And
okay, so this is a train of thought that's going to end badly for him, because what he's saying is there's freedom in Moscow. There's really not freedom in Moscow. Go and just do a simple Google search to prove this out, about how many people have been arrested since the beginning of the war. It'll curl your hair. How many journalists have actually been arrested? And this is just a short list. Moscow Times, which is independent journalism, journalists that have been arrested over time in Moscow since the war began. Here we go. There's a lot of them. And so it's not like there's CNN and others were early in the war pulling people out of being in inside Russia because there were these punitive laws for speaking out against the state. You can get 15 years in jail, or a huge fine, or up to 15 years in jail for not calling it a special military operation, but calling it a war. I mean, this guy, he's not making a profound case.
I think
here.
He should be, of course. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. On the contrary, it's a very good thing. But what I want to say to you is that, oftentimes they say, well, the Russian government, they oppose press freedoms, they crack down on journalists and this and that. And
they do.
There are certainly cases of that. I'm not saying that it's, they never do.
There are certainly cases of this. Let's Google this. How many Russians have gone to jail for opposing the war? More than 15,000 Russians have been arrested in anti-war protests. This is March 22nd of 2022. That's a year ago. So, okay, he's not really making a very strong case here. Let's continue.
But I'm just trying to show you that how the Russians are hosting and allowing foreign correspondents to come to their capital and talk about them, and maybe that's a good thing. It's a good thing to be able to do that as a journalist. You should be able to do that.
It's not like he's sitting there with Putin himself. He is in whatever BBC's building is doing some reporting, and he's got to be very circumspect about what he says at the same time.
I mean, you should obviously not do that if you're wrong. In this case, I feel he's talking about context. He left out a lot of context. But you hear this often, how, the Syrian government, they're cracking down on journalists. The Iranian government, the Russian government, the regimes. They don't say government, right? Regimes. And then you...
By the way, he's talking about, they don't say government, they say regime. The choice of terminology is important. And you're right. They don't say, they say the regime. But Russia says the neo-Nazi regime, or the Nazi regime, or the Kiev regime. They do the same thing. So, Richard, you got to be fair with your facts.
These guys are inside the capital. They're like inside Bashar al-Assad's palace and calling him a war criminal to his face and accusing
He actually is a war criminal. That's
of
true.
using barrel bombs and then saying, "Oh, there's no free press in this country." You just got a visa to interview the president, and you insulted him to his face. How is that not press freedom? You couldn't even do that.
Because it's selective. You're only allowing so much in at a time. There's really not press freedom in the same way in Syria or in Russia as there is in most of the West. So
US, you couldn't even
that's an absolutely absurd
dream
argument.
of doing that. You think Syrian journalists can get access to Joe Biden and then call him a war criminal to his face in the White House?
But
really
again, we're talking about selective.
In Russia, you had Megyn Kelly go and interview Putin and do kind of the same thing. This is such hypocrisy, man. Anyway, going back to the drone strike.
What he's talking about are selective facts, and that's not really a great place to go. If you think that there's more freedom in Russia than there is in the West, pick any country in Europe or the United States or Canada or whatever, you're absolutely dreaming. Look up things like the Heritage Index or Cato's Index of Freedom, and you'll see that there's a huge difference between them.
Strike. Let's leave it at this. The Russians accuse the Ukrainians and the Americans. It's true that we don't have evidence of this. I mean, the Russians haven't provided us with evidence, perhaps because they have, some. It's classified. They don't want to expose the source. I don't know. It doesn't matter. What you should be doing, as an exercise of critical thinking, is asking yourself, who has these kinds of drones? Who would like to launch these kinds of drones? And the answer is very simply, in the end, you come to NATO. Whether it was Ukraine or it was the United States or both.
No, I don't know that you come to NATO, but who can actually get through, can penetrate the ring of air defense around Moscow? That's actually a better question. It might have been Ukrainian special forces. I'm willing to concede that that's a possibility. But it also might have been local partisans who are within the protective zone of the air defense. They're already in, so they can do it. Or it might have been Russian FSB. We don't know. Or it might have been a false flag. We just don't know. And to say that we know is a little arrogant. We just don't want to do that. If you are saying things are true that you can't actually prove are true, you're questionable. And you really are. And this is what I've taken away from Richard Medhurst, that he probably means well. And I believe, now, people are going to say things in the comments like he's on the Russian payroll. I don't believe this. I believe that Medhurst actually believes the things that he's talking about. And so does probably most of the 164,000 subscribers that watch him talk about this. And that's the danger. So I would urge you, if you want to understand a little bit more about this kind of thing, what is true, how to separate facts from narrative, identifying legitimate sources of information, go to these kind of videos and see for yourself. Look, you might not be persuaded by my argument, at least I tried, but I want you to see how you should be judging legitimate sources of information to determine whether they're true. Okay, that's all that I have. Thank you for your time. Thank you for, if you're still watching me at this point, you're awesome. Thank you for caring enough to listen to my argument. Thank you for the coffees. Thank you for the likes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. See you tomorrow.